George, thank you for joining us today and your willingness to be our first person. We have, as you know, we have 1 short hour and now less than that, and you have so much to share with us. We'll start right away if that's okay.
Please.
You were nearly 4.5 years old when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and World War II began. But before we turn to the war years and the Holocaust, tell us first a little bit about your family and their community before the war began.
Well, I have documented evidence that my family, on all my parents' and my grandparents' side, have lived in the Austro-Hungarian area, Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included a number of states, for over 250 years. And so we were quite assimilated. We were not a religious group, but we were more of a cultural and ethnic type of Jews. And most of my family members and extended family members were professional. We had a number of lawyers in our family, we had a number of engineers, we had businessmen and other professions. And I would say that it was an educated middle class. Some of them were richer than others, but that probably characterizes it.
Your mother worked, and there was really, from what you told me, a very clear purpose for why she was working. Will you tell us about that?
Well, we are talking about the early decades of the 20th century. My mother was born in 1901, and at that time, women were expected to go to school until age 16, and usually in the last 3 or 4 years, this was a commercial type school where they were learning typing and bookkeeping and this kind of work. And my mother had 2 brothers, and both of them were expected to be more educated. One of the brothers was going to the medical school in Hungary, and the other brother was studying to be an optometrist. And so it was expected that my mother who lived with the parents, would provide her salary to help her brothers study.
So her work is in order to help her brothers get their advanced education.
Correct. Now, after the First World War, Hungary was a big loser. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart, and Hungary lost 2/3 of its area and about 50% of its population. So my family was very extended, roughly between 150 and 200 people. I have a family tree and many cousins and second cousins and so forth. Most of them did not live in Budapest. We did, the very immediate family. But most of them lived in the provinces. So when Hungary was chopped up, we had relatives in Romania, and Slovakia, and Yugoslavia, and even Austria. And this, of course, had determined the outcome of their lives. And as I will tell you later, we were extremely lucky to live in Budapest. My father was working as an engineer, and just like everywhere else in the early 1930s, Hungary was hit by the Great Depression, and my father lost his job, and it was a very hard few years. My grandfather was a chief engineer of a fairly large company, and because of him, he was able to bring my father in as an engineer. And he worked there until the very beginning of 1939, and then he lost his job for the reason that in 1938 the Hungarian parliament brought in the first anti-Jewish law, which prescribed that a certain number of or percentage of people, professionals, could be Jewish, but the rest of them could not. And the Jews were overrepresented, particularly in law and in medicine and in engineering. So my father lost his job at that point.
So essentially, I think you told me that the Jewish population was, say, 5%. Then these new laws said only 5% of students could be Jewish.
Now, I should mention also that this was not the first Jewish law, technically speaking. The first Jewish law came much earlier than Hitler, and it came in 1921, where they had what they called the numerus clausus, where this 5% applied to university students. And one of my uncles, who was a university student at the time, studying medicine, was kicked out physically and emotionally as well. And not just him, but many of his colleagues. And at that point, the option was to go abroad. And in my uncle's case, he went to Italy, Padua, and he had to start all over again. So it took him over 10 years to get his degree. And then he couldn't find a job because of the Great Depression. And 1 year, just before Hitler came to power, he went to Berlin, and then he came back to Hungary. And he found jobs, but they didn't pay. And so in 1938, he married an American citizen, and he came to this country. And he was the only one from my family, as far as I know, who was able to immigrate legally.
And he would become important in your life many
he
years
became
later.
Important in my life.
Many years later. George, while the full brunt of the war didn't really hit you its full effect until the Germans occupied Hungary in March 1944, nonetheless, life changed significantly with the start of the war. Tell us a little bit about that period between the start of the war and before the German occupation in 1944. What was that time like for your family?
Well, after the so-called first Jewish law came the second Jewish law. And in that second Jewish law, particularly the economic side, on the economic side, the Jewish community was quite squeezed. And people lost their properties, etc. And my father, as I mentioned, lost his job. And so there were a number of unemployed. What do you do with them? Or how do they make a living? Well, in Hungary there was a system which is in German called Strohmann. In English it's a straw man. And what we mean by that was that a Christian person would take out a business license, and under his name he could hire a Jewish person or more than one, and they would work for him. In effect, it was the other way around. The Jews were working, and they would give stipends to these strawman. And that's precisely what happened to my father and many others.
Stipends to essentially do nothing, but they
had a job.
They had the title. They had the title.
They had the title, and they were getting money.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be the super of the building which we lived in. He was a very nice person named Dudek. And this went on for a few years, actually. It started around 1940 and went up to 44. Now, in the second Jewish law, or anti-Jewish law, there was a part which was dealing with people who could or could not be become members of the armed forces in Hungary. And the ones who could not become members, such as the Jews, the communists, the Social Democrats, they were also provided a way of helping or doing something for the quote-unquote Hungarian nation. And this thing was the essentially labor. And it was not just labor, it was more like a slave labor. Mm-hmm. And my father was Hungary did not get into the war until June of 41, until the Germans started an offensive against the Soviets. Until then, Hungary was not part of it.
And just for our audience, so they know for sure, they were utterly allied with the Germans. With the
Yes, yes. And the story there is that, as I mentioned, Hungary was pretty badly chopped up. And Hitler promised the Hungarian government that certain parts of Romania and Slovakia and Yugoslavia would be returned to Hungary. And that was the payback from Hungary that they would become Axis partners, and later on they had to stand up several armies actually to fight in the Eastern Front mostly.
And these labor battalions that were created to do slave labor, your father was affected by that directly.
Yes, my father was affected actually earlier than the war in Hungary. He was in 1940 already called up, and he went to what is now in Ukraine, but at that time it was part of Hungary, for building roads. Now imagine that these people were 40 years old or over, mostly overweight and out of shape, and they got a pick and an axe and stuff like that, and they had to make small stones out of big stones. So it was very, very heavy physical labor for these people. The fortunate thing was that my father's brigade had a very decent person who overseen them. And in these brigades, there were 200-300 Jewish workers, and then about 10 or 20 regular soldiers. And where my father was gone, which is now the Ukraine, he had his cousin, and it's a beautiful place in the Carpathian Mountains, and we visited him, and he was deactivated after 3 months. And after that, life went on. There was a third Jewish law, which was much more like the 1935 law of Nuremberg, which is a racially based law, not just a law which affected the economic well-being of the community, but it was racial in a sense that, for example, a Jew was forbidden to marry a non-Jew, and so forth. I went to a school, meanwhile, and a Jewish elementary school at that time, so I was rather insulated from these kind of things until 1943.
You shared with me an incident that happened in your own building.
Right.
Tell us about that. You were very young.
Right, I was very young. Our building had a couple of Jewish families, but most of them were Christian. Some of them were in sympathy with the Nazis, and some of them were not. And we had non-Christian friends there too, or Christian friends there. There was a man, and he felt that I was not polite enough with him when I saw him somewhere in the building, and he gave me a slap in the face. And I wasn't sure why I never got a slap in the face from my father or mother, so it really shocked me. And this man came back a few hours later and knocked on our door and came back and apologized. And I felt that that was fine. And that was the last person who apologized by hitting me.
He was the last to do that. Yeah.
The last to do that, correct. And in 1942, when the war started with the Soviets in 41, June of 41, but by 1942, the Hungarians were forced to stand up an army, and with the army, 50,000 Jewish men, young men, from 20 to 40, were also called up, and they went to the Ukraine.
For the labor battalions.
For the labor battalions. And by then, things were changing. People were becoming much more brutal to these people. And of course, they went around April or May, and the Russian winter, of course, came, and the army was not ready for it, and the slave laborers were not.
Right.
So many of them died of hunger and torture, and they were having work like looking for mines by hand, and they blew up.
Literally walk in minefields to clear them out.
Walking minefields and so forth. Now, my father was lucky because he was 41 years old, so he was 1 year older than the group. But I had a number of uncles who came, and many of them didn't come back. In fact, 90% of these people did not come back.
What, like 8,000 survived out of 50,000, something like that?
5,000 out of
5,000,
50,000, yes.
Right, right. You, I think it might have been 1943, you were on an outing, I think, with your mother, and you experienced your first incident where you really felt genuinely threatened in a big way, not beyond the man slapping you in the stairwell.
Right. In Hungary was always an anti-Semitic country, but there was an extreme party which is called the Milosz in Hungarian. It's the arrow cross in English, and they were extremely sympathetic pro-Nazi. Mm-hmm. And they had a uniform which was very similar to the SS, and they were gathering, not legally really, it was still a sort of an underground movement. Mm-hmm. But we were, in 1943, we were on vacation in a mountainside, and there was a place where they gathered, and inadvertently my mother and I got into the middle of them, and they were yelling and screaming and so forth. So I was very scared, and my mother and I moved away as fast as we could. But this was my first encounter with this extreme group. Unfortunately, not the last.
No, not the last. The Germans occupied Hungary in March of 1944. Tell us why they did that, briefly, because here Hungary was a loyal ally of the Nazis, but the Germans came in March 1944, and then things changed profoundly, quickly for you.
Yeah, well, Germany or Hungary was a reluctant ally. So much so that in 1942, Hitler demanded that just like the Austrian Jews and all the Jews of Europe, who were by then either dead or in deportation camps, would be turned over to the Germans, Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary, did not allow that. He just refused. And Hitler was not in a position to enforce this. But Hitler was always wary of the fact that there were 825,000 Jews in Hungary, and that was the last of the larger Jewish group.
Anywhere in Europe. Yeah.
Anywhere in Europe. So by 1944, when the Nazis were losing the war, it was obvious to everybody, and they were going to be coming back from Ukraine, the logical way would be for them, for a strategic withdrawal, would be through Hungary. And by then the Hungarian diplomats were already in negotiations with the British and the Russians. So Hitler was afraid that Hungary would change sides. And so they wanted to make sure that Hungary was in their hands. That's why they came in. That was the primary reason. And the secondary reason, and this is debatable which one was the primary and the secondary, but the reason that they had 825,000 Jews still alive there was bothering Hitler and Eichmann and all the people who were working very diligently, quote unquote, on solving the Jewish problem. And so when the SS and the 8 Wehrmacht divisions came, there were Eichmann and 120 Nazi experts. And what happened in Germany in 5 years or more, and in Austria about a year or so, the same scenario played out in 2 months.
2 months. Yeah.
2 months in Hungary. Imagine that everybody in the, first of all, they had a lot of eager helpers in Hungary, which helped them, roughly 30,000 gendarmes in the provinces, and they were very eager to collect the Jews, steal whatever they could, and put them in trains and move them as fast as they could. And this happened in all of 6 weeks, where almost 500,000 Jews were deported, mostly to Auschwitz, and 90%, of course, were immediately gassed. And this we didn't know. And the reason why is because these anti-Jewish laws came out fast and furiously every day, 6 of them. The first thing was to make the Jews, make it impossible for the Jews to travel, to use any kind of public transportation or private transportation. They took the cars, the bicycles, everything. And then they took the telephones away, so we had no communication with our friends and relatives in the province.
Radios were banned.
Radios were banned, was taken,
Yeah.
along with valuables. And so this is what happened. It was only 10 or 15 days after they came in when they imposed the yellow star on us all. And then the next thing was to, and this is not Budapest, they moved very fast in the provinces. Roughly 47 trains were derailed and used explicitly for the deportation of the Hungarian Jews.
To take them right to Auschwitz.
To take them to Auschwitz. But Budapest was the last one because it had a very large Jewish population. And so they left it in last, and they were going to start it in the very beginning of July. But July of 1944, if you recall your history, the Allies already landed in Normandy about a week before or 2 weeks before, and they had airports, and large bombers were bombing Budapest, actually. And by then, we were forced to leave our house, our building, because that was not a Jewish building, so we had to move with relatives to one of these buildings you mentioned earlier.
What they call a Jewish home with a star.
Jewish star, yeah. And so 25% roughly of the population of Budapest was Jewish, but they squeezed us into 5% of the room, and so every room had to have 3-4 people in it. And we moved in with one of my grandmother's sister. And in addition to that, of course, we couldn't take our furniture or anything. In addition to that, there was curfew, 22 hours out of every 24 hours. And the curfew was...
Curfew on Jews, not on the population.
No,
Right.
Curfew on Jews.
Right.
Between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, which was too late to buy food because everybody bought the food earlier, and there were a number of people, number of businesses who would not serve Jews even if they had food. So we had a problem having food. And then besides this, we had these very, very heavy bombing raids. And after the bombing raids started, the regent of Hungary decided that supposedly, and this is a controversial thing, he, in his memoir, said he did not know the deportation of the 500,000 Hungarian citizens.
Of his citizens, that he didn't know.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
He didn't know it until the 1st or 2nd of July, and then he stopped. I think a few historians don't really believe that. But the fact was that he did stop it, and it frustrated Eichmann and company, and they left. And this was in the middle of July. And from the middle of July until the end of September, there was a new government, a military government basically. And we had the same kind of restrictions, but we did not have to worry about, at that point, of deportation.
During that period of time.
Right.
George, I want to ask you a couple of questions. There's so much that we can't cover, I know, but while you're dealing with all the fears of being deported, all the restrictions, as you said, there's all this bombardment going on, all the bombing raids. I want you to share the incident where I believe it was your aunt had a piece of glass in her head. And
yeah, well, what had happened is 2nd of July was the critical day when we were already in these Jewish homes, and there was what they call the carpet bombing, where the participation of roughly 1,000 British and American bombers, and roughly 30% of the city was in ruins after that. And we were very lucky. We had 4 bombs dropped within a few hundred yards of our building. But sitting through a 3-hour raid is not exactly what I would call a pleasant experience. And I was horrified. And my mother saw, imagine sitting in a small room and these big bursts of light, actually, as well as sound came. And from then on, I was always horrified with, and even today, if there is an unexpected noise,
it still affects you, yeah.
It affects me. And my mother always put a big pillow over my head to muffle the noise after that. Because after this, bombings, raids became rather frequent.
You said you almost could set your clock by the bombing.
You could set your clock at 11 in the morning. The Americans and the British came, and 9 o'clock at night, the Russians came.
Yep.
And so we were in a double jeopardy. Yep. We were And not just us, the whole population, of course, was endangered by this. And the bombs were, at that time, were going all over the place.
So tell us about your aunt.
Pardon me?
About your aunt. You wanted to get her medical care.
Yes, well, that happened after one of these bombing raids. She was living with my grandparents who had their own house not too far from where we were. And she was hurt by a flying piece of glass and bleeding. And my father, after the raid, went over to her and asked and brought her to our house. And one of the neighbors were what they called ethnic Germans. And the brother, there were two women, they were sisters, and they had a brother who was an SS doctor. And naively we asked him to give my aunt first aid. And he was looking at us, he says, you know, I am right-handed, but with my left hand I already killed 20 Jews. I haven't even started it with my right hand. I am certainly not going to give you any kind of. And he turned out to be one of the so-called doctors in Auschwitz who were selecting people. And so this went on, and my father was, of course, taken between 16 and 60. All the men were called up after the Germans came in for slave labors. And my father was sent to the western end of Hungary. And he was there, we knew that, and in September, his unit came back to Budapest. For what reason, we don't know, but it was a very lucky sort of a thing. He had a very good man who commanded the unit. His fiancée lived with us. He had a Jewish fiancée. And by the end of September, things were very, very tense. And the war was already in territory of Hungary, not far from Budapest.
And the Russian army is advancing.
The Russian army was advancing from the... So on October 15 of 1944, after a couple of months after the Romanians switched sides, and in fact the Romanian army came with the Red Army and fighting against the Germans and the Hungarian army. The Hungarian government finally decided, not government, region, decided to proclaim Hungary's neutrality. Well, it was a laugh, you know, because there was no army behind him.
Right.
There was only one division who was loyal to him, and the rest of them were not. And so in 2 hours there was a small firefight. He was caught and his family were caught, and they deported them actually.
And of course, the Iron Cross that you mentioned earlier is now pretty much they're in control.
Well, yeah, and
with the Nazis.
In the same day, the Arrow Cross leader, Milosz was his name, was pronounced to be head of the government.
Right.
And then Eichmann came in, and 10 days later, 10,000 young women, among them several of my aunts, were rounded up and deported to Ravensbrück. Most of them didn't come back, including my aunt. And by the end of October, roughly 50,000 Jews of Budapest were already deported. And by then, the transportation was quite shaky.
Because the rail lines were bombed.
Because the rail lines were bombed, etc. So people had to walk 200 miles to the Austrian border, and then from there they would take them by railroad. And Many of them couldn't walk. Roughly 50% were shot by the Hungarian Nazis. And my father came back one day and said that they got the order of being deported the next day, but he got a furlough and he was not going to go. And then we didn't hear from him for 10 days. And then 10 days later, an army soldier came to our house and gave us a piece of note from my father saying, I am now in hiding in a factory, and come with the soldier and join, but don't tell anybody else. Now my mother felt very bad because she had 4 aunts and her mother and other relatives, cousins and so forth, and we were told not to tell them. And so we did go very reluctantly. Right. And we went, and this was a textile factory before the war, owned by a Jewish person, Freudiger, and this textile factory at that time was used as a camouflage to be able to hide roughly 70 people like my father who were not willing to be deported but were trying to escape. And they all brought back their families, so from 60 it went to 170. And if you went in, what you would see is people working with Hungarian uniforms, very diligent.
Making uniforms for the Hungarian soldiers. Yeah.
Right, making uniforms for the Hungarian soldiers. There was a soldier outside with a gun, and they had all sorts of things showing that this was a very important factory. But in fact, it wasn't.
It was complete ruse. It was a complete
It was
cover.
a complete ruse, and we had 22 children, and the rest of them were adults. And this went on. It's a very complicated story because you can imagine the logistics problems. You know, how do you bring food to these people? And it turned out that there were 4 factories which were done. And it was a complicated organization. Zionists, communists, everybody else.
And completely covert.
Completely covert, yeah. Yes. And but we didn't know this, of course. Right. This was later on when we found out. So on December the 2nd, somebody betrayed the person who was the brain. His name was Kormos, brain behind it, and the Hungarian Gestapo got him. And they already knew about 3 out of the 4 places.
Yeah.
3 out of the 4 places. One was ours. So they raided us, about 4 of them, and they had a submachine gun, and they selected out the men and the women and the children, and look at the walls, and we thought that that's it, that's the end. Well, it wasn't the end, fortunately, for 2 reasons. One is that we had a number of well-to-do people with dollars and brilliants and all these kind of precious stones and so forth, and they were able to bribe these people. Now, these people were not stupid. By now, the Soviet army was about 10 miles from Budapest, and they knew that this war, as far as they were concerned, is going to be pretty soon over. So if they would have a massacre there, there would be somebody inevitably who would have been an eyewitness, and they would be having trouble. But so they didn't. And they didn't kill us, and they told us that if there is a problem, they let us know, and we can call them also. And so they left. But then the leadership of this group where we were, decided that the children would be better off if they were in a Red Cross place, a Red Cross orphanage for children, and 22 of us were taken there. I was among the oldest. The youngest was 6 months old.
But all 22 children that had been in the textile factory were now sent to this orphanage. And you-
Correct,
and you-
correct. And the orphanage was right in the middle of the city, and we were sort of a little bit on the outside. So they took us, and it was a big building with 500 kids, and they were dirty and hungry, and there were very little supervision there. And this friend of mine,
And you're 10 years old at this point.
I was 10 years
10
old.
years old, yeah.
A friend of mine and I decided that this is not a place to stay. And we decided to get out. Now, this building was closed overnight, and around 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, the workers, the Red Cross workers, came in. We had like 30 kids in the floor, and everybody was hungry and dirty. And we told one of them, a lady, that we have some money and we would like to go out and buy food. And if she would let us or come with us. And she said, okay. And so she let us out, and then we ran away from her. And we went back to the place where my mother and father was, and my friend's family. And we found out later on that about a week later, these children were taken to the Danube, and they were all shot. So out of the 22 children, only the 2 of us.
The 2 of you were the only ones.
If you remember the last picture which Bill showed, there were 2 child. I was one and another one, and that's it. And the other 500, most of them died.
George, in the little time we have left, tell us now, as the Russians are really now on the city limits, basically, the siege of Budapest is about to begin. You are moved then into the Jewish ghetto, into a building there, and you were there through the entire end of the war.
Right. What happened is, after we returned to the hiding place, about maybe a week later, 2 officers show up and told us that the Hungarian Gestapo guys think that across the street there is a Arrow Cross headquarters, and they are starting to be a little bit suspicious of us. And by then, at the end of November, the Hungarian ghetto, Budapest ghetto, opened. Now, the Budapest ghetto was a very unique place. Number one, it was the last ghetto in the whole of Europe. All the ghettos were already evacuated and people died. So that was one, and it was the end of November. They could not deport us because the Russians completely encircled the city. So the best way they thought was to compress 70,000 Jews who were in Budapest at that time, plus those who were in hiding, into a very, very small place. Small, I mean, a few blocks.
Few blocks, yeah.
And they thought that before the Russians come, we would be massacred. And there were plans for the SS to come in and the Hungarian Nazis come in and massacre us. Now, the ghetto was put together in a hurry, and so they had these, the walls were not made of bricks, but only of wood. And so the ghetto leadership, the Jews, were making sure that this wood was loosened so that if the Nazis came in, then people could run and some of people would be able to survive. Fortunately, this didn't happen. And we were in a building which was housing also about 200 old people from a Jewish old age home.
We're in your building.
In the building where we were ended up in the ghetto. And they were in very bad shape already to begin with. And then when the siege began, which was Christmas Day, 1944, everybody went down to the basement. Now the basement in these old houses were not finished. They had dust or dirt there. Mm-hmm. So the first thing you do is to dig a latrine in the middle of it. And then you have some sheets or something. But I mean, you can imagine 200 people in a place which is maybe a quarter of the size of this.
In a damp basement with a dirt floor.
Right.
And winters generally in Europe are really tough. That was an especially harsh winter.
It was a harsh winter. We had no water, we had no electricity, and nothing.
Nothing.
And
including food, of course.
Including food. Well, food was available except for the fact that they had sharpshooters on the top of every building, and if they saw somebody walking on the street, they would shoot them. Mm-hmm. So it was, although food was available, would have been available, nobody was volunteering to go out and get shot.
Right.
And so for about 3 weeks, we practically had no food. And of course, the old people died first, and when there was a lull in the fighting, these people were taken out, and we had the central square right in front of the building, and there were maybe a 6 or 7 feet high pile of
bodies.
dead bodies. It turned out to be over 3,000 people who were found after that. Mm-hmm. And so, because of the closeness and because of all the dirt and lack of hygiene, of course, everybody was full of lice. Mm-hmm. And it was
it's unimaginable for most of us.
A very, very terrible situation.
Yeah. And then it turned into door-to-door fighting taking place around you.
Right, there were door-to-door fighting, and what happened is these buildings, whoever was in Europe know that the buildings are next to each other, and so what they did, or we did, is to have the walls open so you could walk within a block, 10, 15 buildings, underground.
Underground.
Okay. And the SS knew this. And one day an SS kid came in who spoke Hungarian and said, well, don't think that you are going to be surviving. We have the ghetto mind, and we will blow you up just before the Russians come in. So that didn't.
So here, they know that they're about to be overrun, and they've lost, and they're still spending their energy trying to kill all the Jews in there.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
And meanwhile, there were some houses which we called safe houses or protected houses, and they were protected by the Wallenberg group. Swiss, Vatican, Spanish, and there were about 15,000 Jews in addition to the big ghetto. Mm-hmm. And they had special papers, and up until the beginning of January, the Hungarian Nazis were looking at the paper and let the people go. But after that, they were starting to raid these houses. and hundreds of people were lined up in the Danube and were shot, just like those 500 children I was talking about. And so it became very dangerous, and most of those people were taken to the already overcrowded ghetto. So we had another few thousand.
George, tell us, you were liberated, I think, if it was not your 11th birthday, it was very close to your 11th birthday.
A couple of months.
Tell us how you knew you were liberated. When did it end? At that stage, of course,
right.
It is not over for a very long time, in truth, but
yeah.
For you, when did the fighting stop?
Well, that finally stopped, you know, when you are hearing 24/7 this awful noise of shells going, and several shells hit the building, actually, where we were, and bombings and rockets and everything else, all this noise, all of a sudden, there was dead silence in one morning. And, you know, this was sort of deafening. The silence was deafening. And we had a little window quite high, and somebody went up, and you couldn't see much, but you could see the shoes or the footwear of whoever was out there. And we were very familiar with the SS footwear, but this footwear was not familiar at all. So, and it was quiet. So we figured that that must have been the Russians. And then one or two persons went out, and indeed the Russians were there. And a lot of dead people were among us by then, whom we couldn't take out. And there was a very quiet sort of, everybody was quiet, and nobody was yelling and
jubilant over liberation,
jubilant,
right?
No. And my father decided that we would go home around noontime. And my father and my mother were so weak, because whatever food was, they gave it to me, that one of the crown jewels of the family was a little suitcase, a very little suitcase, really a child's suitcase, and it was full of family pictures. And my father, and the whole thing probably weighed 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds. My father and my mother were so weak that I was carrying.
You had to carry it, yeah.
And it took us 4 hours to get back to where we were kicked out the summer before. And we went into the bunker there. The siege of Budapest was not over. The siege of Pest was over, but Buda took another month. And many people who saw us became quite white, particularly those who were of Nazi persuasion, that here these 2 Jews or 3 Jews survived. Mr. Dudek was very, very happy.
He was the supervisor.
He was the straw man. He was the straw man, yes, and we left him with a big suitcase of food, which was like rice and pasta and things like that. And so, of course, he gave it back to us, and he made room for us in the bunker. And then we were in the bunker for another couple of months before we went out.
George, we're at the end of our time. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll close our program, so stay with us, please, until we finish, because we're going to hear from George again. But my last question, George, you had this very large extended family. How many survived out of your family?
I could tell you how many died, roughly 130 of them, and roughly 34 survived. Yes.
George, thank you. There's obviously, we really just touched the surface of what George described to us in brief. And then, of course, the war is going to continue until May of 1945. There's the post-war period. George then proceeded to live under communist rule until he escaped from Hungary in 1956. You'd want to hear all about that. His memoir is hopefully going to be published in the not too distant future and be an opportunity for all of us to learn a whole lot more. I want to thank all of you for being with us. Remind you that we'll have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until August 8th. If you can't come back, all of our programs, including today's, are available on the museum's YouTube page, so please take advantage of that. When George concludes our program, our photographer, Joel, right here, the one who took all those glorious photos you saw earlier, is going to come up on stage and take a picture of George with you as the background. So we want you to stay for that if you would do that.
Yeah.
It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so on that note, I want to turn to George to close today's program.
Thank you. I used to say that we should teach toleration and that we should be able to tolerate people of different persuasion, religious, racial, and so forth. And now I am saying we should be and must be intolerant. Why intolerant? Intolerant against what? Intolerant against bigotry and hate and racism and anti-Semitism, which is again coming up. You know, us survivors feel that we are back in the 1930s, and we are very concerned and afraid. Everywhere, in Europe in particular, but even in this country. Do not be a bystander. Be active in your community against evils, against hatred of any sort, be it in your community or anywhere else. Now in many areas of the world, genocides are raging again. Instead of what we used to say, never again, it's over and over and over again, and it's intolerable. Be intolerant against the evil, whether it's a global evil or a local evil. We have shootings in schools. You know that. It's almost a daily occurrence. It cannot be tolerated. You must do something. And so I want to finish as my last word. Look out for all signs of hatred, all signs of anti-Semitism, and do something about it. And that's my last word. Thank you.